Thank you, Sanne, for the kind introduction, and to the Institute for inviting me to share my research with you tonight. As mentioned by Sanne, my name is Ida, and I'm a PhD fellow with the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies, but also affiliated, or my project is also in collaboration with the Museum of Copenhagen, which and we sort of it is funded by Carlsberg. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about my current research, which I'm doing in context of my PhD, which I'm about halfway through. So there's still quite a few open questions, but I'll kind of invite you into what I'm currently working with tonight. And my research project, From Goal to Oblivion and Back, a site, surface and user-sensitive study of monuments in public space, long title, centers around a case study of a group of polychrome plaster sculptures and reliefs, which I refer to as the polychromatic business group. They don't really have a title, so I have chosen to name them after their distinctive polychrome surfaces and the head sculptor behind their creation, Willem Bissen. In my research, I use this group as an entry point to explore monuments and public sculptures as dynamic phenomena, and ask questions of how they change across time and space. And tonight I'll start with a brief introduction to the case, and then I'll elaborate later. But this introduction will be followed by an elaboration of the framework for how we can approach sculpture and monuments as dynamic phenomena, and how we can better understand their entanglement across time and space. Now, plaster sculptures such as these might not be what we typically associate with public sculptures or monuments, as their material is lighter, it's less durable than stone or bronze, which are commonly preferred for outdoor installations. Yet their medium and intended function to commemorate and to embellish in a public space is the same. And as many public sculptures and monuments, these sculptures have moved, and their function and appearance and meaning have been renegotiated several times in the process. So, and moving on to my first encounter with them, it was, as I mentioned, in context of my work as a collections assistant and archaeologist with the Museum of Copenhagen. And it was back in September 2021, was when these photos were taken. And this was when I, along with two of my colleagues who are conservators with the museum, were asked to perform a survey and condition assessment of these sculptures. At the time, as you can see in the photos, they were crammed in behind a shell wall. The shell wall stood on the 9th floor of Copenhagen City Hall Tower. And the wall was probably put up around 1970 based on this number painted on the back of one of the panels. And the likelihood of this is also strengthened by the fact that that was when the previous renovation of the tower took place. And as the wall was still there in 2021, it had successfully, this is what it looked like before it came down, the wall had successfully hidden the sculptures from the public and let them slip into oblivion for 50 years. Something which, of course, drastically changed when the tower needed to be renovated once more, and consequently demanded that decisions and an action plan to be created for their future. And sort of this collaboration with the Museum of Copenhagen between the City Hall was quite natural, because basically the Copenhagen City Museum had its beginnings in the City Hall attics and tower back in around 1900, and was housed there up until 1956. This is some of the quite early exhibitions in the museum up there. So it's natural that we would also be involved in trying to figure out what these sculptures were. So the group as it is now currently consists of 65 objects, 3 plaster sculptures and 2 sculptural groups in the round, 2 plaster consoles, 53 plaster reliefs ranging from coats of arms to crowns, as you can see, and 4 canvas paintings, like I can find there we are, like this one, and a sheet metal sign, which you can't really see on this picture. The iconography is related to the Danish coat of arms, including lions and wood roses with clubs, as well as the coat of arms of several European households, such as the Russian and British empires, the Kingdom of Greece, and the city of Copenhagen. All of which was accompanied by a single statue of the ancient Greek god of weddings, Hymenaeus, here in the shape of a youth holding up 2 wedding torches, or bridal torches. And during the encounter with the group, it was quite obvious that they had had an eventful existence before they ended up behind the wall. And they were not only influenced by breakages, but also missing appendages, and there were also depositions of coins, ticket stubs, chewing gum, beer bottles, and lids. You can see the beautiful little red cap that is placed like a hat on top of one of the wood roses. But also under the thick layer of dust were also extensive amounts of graffiti as well as old restoration attempts. And this was quite notable, we thought, as eventful existences are not something we conventionally have associated with sculptures or see reflected in public spaces. Conventionally, sculpture as a medium is defined and perceived as solid, stable, three-dimensional visual objects, the analysis of which is typically focused on their form. And one of the most repeated distinctive features that I've come across is that they are phenomenologically in the same space as us, or occupy the same space as us. And a central point to this perception of sculpture is that for centuries they have been one of the preferred mediums for monuments, and consequently the concept of statuesque sculpture is perceived to be not only stable, but also site-specific, resistant to change, and immovable. A domineering logic established by art historian Rosalind Krauss in her seminal 1979 article, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, which connects the logic of sculpture with the logic of monuments, and essentially established an academic view that the logic of sculptures is that they are static. These views are, however, not unchallenged in academia, and in 2019, the major sculptor Lise Skytte Jacobsen, Danish art historian, argues for a more dynamic notion of sculptures by directing attention to their mobile and heteromedial potential, as well as the unstable nature of the sculpture surfaces, which I will return to in a moment. And the importance of considering these aspects in our analysis of sculpture. And as I mentioned that sculpture is a popular medium for monuments, I would argue that these should also be included or extended to how we work with monuments as well. Another point is that to this kind of breakage with the static monument is that, especially in the past decade, we have been confronted time and time again with these unstable traits of monuments and sculpture in public spaces, which has been visible through the global circulation of images and reports in various media in the wake of protests of their toppling and modification with paint or graffiti. And more recently, these reports are often now followed by new reports and images of the subsequent cleaning processes, like this one, initiated by city and state officials, which I would say highlight the ephemerality of and obscurity that characterizes interventions such as these. And I suspect that most interventions, both sanctioned and unsanctioned, I would say these unsanctioned, this sanctioned intervention, do not make it to the media, and therefore are not noticed by most people unless we engage regularly with a sculpture and see them. And I would also argue that these, the ephemerality of these types of interventions and of decay due to ongoing preservation and restoration efforts is vital in the upkeep of an appearance, or I would say illusion, of stability and timelessness of these types of objects. So now is the big question: how might we approach an exploration of that question, how a sculpture or monument changes over time and space? With Lise Skytte-Jacobsen in mind, it seems obvious to approach such a study with a sensitivity to their site and their surfaces, and to map the development of these diachronically to understand the impact they have on the relation to the meaning and function and perception of the sculptures, and attempt to establish a timeline, or write a biography, if you will, of these developments. And now I say these sensitivities, so what do they actually mean? Well, a site sensitivity will essentially decenter the sculpture from this site-specific notion, and that connects them with a single site, and instead embrace their mobile potential. While a surface-sensitive approach would essentially mean that we embrace that the surface has a dynamic potential and is agile and negotiable. But with these in mind, I also decided to include a user sensitivity to my approach in order to recognize that monuments and sculptures do not exist in a vacuum, but engage with their surroundings, the surrounding environments, infrastructure, and people. And that this sensitivity actively considers the relationship between the materiality of the sculptures and the users. So basically, I've subsequently attempted to match the journey of the polychromatic Thyssen group with these sensitivities in mind. And I started by doing this through archival material and the historical record, which has turned out to be quite spotty, and a surprise to no one, maybe. And some searches had to be guided by clues revealed by the sculptures themselves. And I'm just going to take a sip of water. With this, and one of the first and most vital clues to where they came from, what their function was an old registration number painted onto several of the objects, which is the number you see there, which enabled us to look them up in old City Hall collection protocols, and via these identify not only what the sculptures had been created for, but also by whom. I'm not going to read all of this up, because then we can be here until tomorrow. But the protocol essentially confirmed that the group had been created for an ephemeral triumphal arch raised on Højbro Square in the municipality of Copenhagen, and by the municipality of Copenhagen, in connection with the celebration of the Danish King Christian IX and Queen Louise's golden wedding in May 1892. The triumphal arch was acting as a centerpiece on the route which the royal family drove through the city in their carriages during the celebrations, and was where the municipal council could offer their congratulations to the happy couple and the royal family on this spectacular occasion. And as you can see, this event was quite well attended, and during the days surrounding it, it was also quite well reported. But in historical writing, it's more of a footnote. So, and regularly you just see the photo, and that's about it. But the iconography of the sculptures of the polychromatic Thyssen group does reflect the occasion of the royal golden wedding perfectly. As the royal couple are often referred to as the in-laws of Europe, due to their children's illustrious marriages into, among others, the royal families of England and Russia. And it quite fitting that also that this journey through the city of Copenhagen was led by a Himalayas flying ahead of them. But the records also referred to something else, the protocol, and it revealed that it had been designed by the municipal architect of Copenhagen, thus giving us the first image or medial edition of the sculptural group. And this architect was Professor Ludwig Fenger, and the mention of him actually allowed me to find the sketch and quite a few other of the paperwork related to the production of and building of this triumphal arch. But what I also find really interesting about this drawing is that it reflects quite a different idea. If we look at the topic up here to how it was supposed to look, and indicates that there was definitely possibly a discussion about what it should look like with the artist who actually was hired to model them, who was, as it was also revealed, the prominent Danish sculptor, Professor Willem Bissen, that I've already mentioned. And he was, according to the protocol, we can also see that he didn't do this on his own, but that he was actually the head of a larger group of sculptors who was modeling these sculptures in the days, I would almost say, before, days and weeks before this celebration. Because according to a newspaper article at the time, up until quite a few days before, I think 5 days before the big event of the triumphal arch, they were still painting and modeling away in the workshop. So we have now the intended function of the ephemeral arch of the sculptures. They were an ephemeral monument that celebrated the royal golden wedding and family. A prestigious project, I would say, for the municipality, considering how expensive it was. It was criticized widely by socialist newspapers, which I would say that kind of confirms how much money went into it. And it's also reflects its prestigiousness that they had hired one of the most prominent sculptors at the time. But I will also say that a hire of Willem Bissen is possibly also motivated by the experience, the size of his workshop, and ability to deliver on short time, which I would say is a big motivation also. However, and going on from there, what happened afterwards, how they ended up in the City Hall now. The next clue was actually also revealed by the sculptures themselves, and were these two paper stickers that was found on them, either on them or in them. And they led me to discover these two photographs, and that a selection of the sculptures and reliefs, which you can see in these photos, had actually been moved to the Industry and Art exhibitions in Malmö in 1896 and Stockholm in 1897, but not as an example of the sculptural qualities of Denmark, but as actual decorations once more, framing the Danish contributions to these exhibitions. And what is notable is that it's not either recorded in the ledgers of the time that they were moved there or used there. It's only visible through these two images and the two pieces of paper that we found. And I can't really find anything that describes them either, so they were definitely not noted in the exhibitions. And you can see in Stockholm it's only the Danish coat of arms that are transported there. So, after they returned to Denmark once more, it appears that they slid into Oblivion one of the first times, as they were put into storage, seemingly put into storage on the attic of the main fire station in Copenhagen, which is across from the City Hall, and were forgotten there, and seemingly forgotten there until the beginning of 1905, where they were discovered, and, as it mentions in the newspaper, moved to the budding exhibitions and collections in the City Hall attics. And in the following years, you can actually find quite a few newspaper articles referring to them in their first exhibitions as a friendly review or a re-acknowledgement that they exist. But the first actual photo I've found, or visual evidence, is of this space in 1907, where you can actually see what they were exhibited along with. And they were mixed with decorations from other royal celebrations, public celebrations of events in the royal family, and an old gate to Panum, likewise with similar iconographical distinctions. And basically they're reflecting, it seems, a narrative about how the monarchy has been celebrated in the city, and the city's relationship, I would say, with the monarchy over the years, and specifically in the end of the 19th century. And if you thought this was a bit spotty, then over the next few years it becomes even more so. But, see? Oh, I moved along a bit too quickly. There we are. And I've actually only these two photos show as evidence of the new or the reconfigurations of the exhibitions in the City Hall at this time. And it appears from these two photos from the 1910s that the Humanaya sculpture was exhibited for a time independently from the rest of the sculptures from the Triumphal Arch, and instead exhibited with models for more recent public decorations and commemorative new commemorations in the city, as well as retired old decorations. And basically it now is a part of a narrative about how commemorative practice has developed in the city of Copenhagen. But the next photo also shows that they moved again, and once again I do not have any written record of this, but it seems to correspond with a greater reorganization of the collections housed in the City Hall attic in the years between 1920 and 1925, based on the curator at the time's memoirs. And it seems that it at this time moved towards a more chronological narrative, which would, I would say, argue that it's possible that the Humanias was moved to be exhibited along with the rest of the sculptures from the Triumphal Arch. But that's a speculation. However, it is, I would say, possible, just move to there we are, that all of the sculptures at this time had been moved, back in the 1920s, had been moved into the City Hall Tower. Based on this drawing from 1941, which shows the wood roses with little arch-coated arms exhibited on the 9th floor of the City Hall Tower. And another like obscure indicator of how they were exhibited at this time comes from an English guidebook to the City Hall that mentions that decorations from the Royal Golden Wedding were exhibited on the 7th and 9th floor of the City Hall. So in a way you can say they now again come together to show the original story, as opposed to a commemorative, general commemorative history or narrative. They now again show how the city of Copenhagen celebrated this golden wedding. And this sort of leads us to 1970, when they are most likely assembled behind the wall, and up until the present. And this was quite a quick run through of some of the physical movements that I've been able to trace, or changes in the environment. And I've tried to sort of collect it on this page to actually show how many points of intervention in their environment there's been over the years. And I have a couple of points with this slide. One, this chart definitely reflects the mobile potential and also, I would say, the huge medial potential of the sculpture and monuments. And in this case, the sculptures have moved from the architectural drawing onto the sculptor's workshop to the original intended function, decorating this ephemeral monument in celebration of the in-laws of Europe. But also that they have since then had an unintended longevity, moving in and out of the public eye and reach, I would say, with varying functions and constellations, from framing Danish contributions at the industrial and art exhibitions in Sweden before the turn of the century, to various roles as museum objects, and back into oblivion again. And then now, as the final line sort of shows, in a limbo between their rediscovery, conservation, and reframing in a new exhibition. But I would also say that this does not reflect on the many episodes of engagement that we could see on the surfaces and forms of the sculptures, and which are not discernible from conventional historical sources, and which are often not possible to date accurately, and consequently difficult to place in a timeline like such as this. And these episodes, to really study them, it requires us to take a step closer physically and historically and look before we can actually understand their relation to the episodes just described. And I would say that, in the words of Rubio in Still Life, that proximity allows us to appreciate some things that are often lost in the distance, such as this material that I just shown. And stepping closer to study these engagements that are more difficult to pin down, we need a different approach to actually perceive these episodes and how they fit into these entanglements and journey and narrative of this group. And it demands a non-linear narrative in order to actually proceed to understand this. So how can we actually proceed from here? I would like to now bring attention to the surfaces and how they work in a theoretical kind of perspective before turning to how I actually use these thoughts and how we can incorporate them into the narrative. So they are, as mentioned, quite overlooked, and the analytical tradition, analytical tradition of sculptures, has commonly focused on the form and the motif. And in the research of monuments, there's also been, understandably, a significant focus on their commemorative function and conception. Lise Skøtte Jakobsen points out in her book, Meet the Sculpture, that I mentioned before, that the form of the sculpture does not necessarily equal to the sculptural image that we see, but that the sculptural image is an agile membrane that is in and on the surface of sculptural objects. An image that can be subject to negotiation. It can be applied, changed, and removed. This is most visibly exemplified by the ongoing academic and aesthetic debate on polychrome, on ancient as well as modern sculptures. However, Skøtte Jakobsen also stresses that even when the surface, the sculptural image, appears fixed, it is an inherently unstable aspect of sculpture, and subsequently also of the monuments that they can be medium for. An example I quite like of this is of a seemingly fixed surface is the material authentic surface and which we see on many modern sculptures and statues of bronze and stone. However, as this image, or these two images show, this is not necessarily the case. To the left, over here, you see an image of a sculpture of the philosopher Hornung Havgaard outside of the Marble Church in Copenhagen. This photo is taken before 2019. That's the most accurate I can say. It's found on a public tourist website. But this photo next to it, my husband recorded for me about a month ago. And it definitely reflects an intervention applied to this seemingly fixed surface. There's definitely been an intervention of cleaning, but also possibly wax, the application of wax afterwards, or other like surface treatments to make sure that it has as much longevity as possible, this cleaning. And it's also likely in other contexts than this, or similar contexts, that anti-graffiti coatings are applied to sort of uphold these sanctioned appearances. And the intention of this intervention is not dissimilar to the approach we see to art objects in museum collections, where stability and permanence, and when necessary, the reestablishment of apparent sameness is a known practice. So, this just shows some of these possible surface interventions that we do not always hear about, except maybe the first two ones. But the reproduction of stability upheld by characters is invisible, as I mentioned, to most people, because we only deal with them in fleeting encounters, and these seemingly fixed surfaces are often disrupted, even fleetingly, by graffiti or other interaction forms, such as mud, as you see down here. And when we see them, these seemingly disrupted surfaces, we often change our perception of them. We might think that their intended commemorative purpose have expired, even that they have been turned off, so to speak, to deteriorate in our public spaces. And they can also maybe give us a clue in that the validity of the monument or sculpture is contested, or that it has been repurposed to perform other tasks. And but the interventions that reaffirm the intended appearances also erase these traces of change and transformation, especially if it's unaddressed and unnoted. So all of these are possibly, if they are not noted down and shared, how can we then approach them and include them into the narrative? And I think one of the things that I found quite useful is the theoretical and methodological approach of thinking of them as itinerant objects, because to better understand these entanglements that are over time. And itineraries, unlike biographies, examine the non-linear, relational, spatialized and temporalized flow of things, and recognize that motion does not necessarily equal to physical movement in the three-dimensional space, but also embrace heteromediality and the metamorphosis of material objects into other mediums. Object itineraries are open-ended and multidirectional, thus allowing us to understand present entanglements as well as past and acknowledge future possibilities. And I think an important aspect of this approach is that it recognizes all episodes as equals. And this is particularly important when we talk about monuments, as we tend to talk about episodes subsequent to their intended function as afterlives. And the issue of this is that it privileges the intended function in research as well as in care, and at the same time it ascribes subsequent episodes as something beyond the norm, which I would argue is not the case. And one of the things that it also, this notion of itinerancy of these sculptures and monuments also envelops is that all of the episodes exist in the same time for the sculptures. Even if they are no longer visibly, physically visible, it is a matter of our own perception and knowledge that determines our potential to see it and acknowledge it. And I know this is quite abstract, so I tried to draw it when I started working with this. And this is sort of how I could see a potential itinerary could look like, with also the possibilities of fragmentations and additions as a part of this, the itinerary of this group. So this quite theoretical run along will now be put into good use, I promise. And I'll now turn to some of the examples of how I'm actually working with this theoretical perspective in trying to unlock the meaning of these interventions that we can see and re-entangle them, so to speak, on the itinerary. And taking a step closer, we can then start to see it. If you start to turn by turning to one of the most general and visible interventions. So here you can sort of see some of them are quite visibly datable. The author of the interventions have given us the date, but most of them have to be related to other aspects on the journey they've been through already to unlock their meaning. And just a second, I just lost my, there we are. And here we can, the first one I would like to turn to is one of the most prevalent interventions now on these sculptures, which is what I call I was here graffitis. And basically the I was here graffitis are mainly made up by names, initials, sometimes accompanied by dates, or by the country the person comes from, or similar aspects. They show up independently or in relation. They are encircled, drawn in hearts, and basically the surface of the sculptures is a background. But there are some cases that actually use the iconography of the sculptures. So I think this is one of the best examples where one of the hearts in the Danish coat of arms has been repurposed to make a little love declaration. But this varies greatly all over the sculptures. On their own, they seem quite mundane, I would say, but collectively they actually do tell a story. And one of the first things I kind of wanted to make sure of that this was not something that happened independently, if it happened independently on the sculptures, or if it was something that was traceable elsewhere in the exhibition spaces. So I started by looking at other places in the City Hall and discovered that this is this mark-making practice of I was here is something that is taking place generally across both statues, interiors and walls of the Copenhagen City Hall. So it's been a great practice of interventions and inscribing yourself into these spaces and relating that you have been there. And this is, of course, not an unknown practice. Visitor mark-making on sites of note since antiquity to the present have been performed all sorts of places. Here you can see two examples from Italy, or Rome, more specifically on the Pantheon and the Colosseum. And this type of mark-making, like graffiti on monuments, is generally frowned upon, if not criminalized. Yet it keeps being performed over and over again. And when looking on the surfaces of the sculptures and reliefs on Nightfall, you at first get a sense that there's perhaps been only a limited attempt to stop this sort of practice. However, taking a step closer, one realizes that these services have been subject to renegotiations performed by sanctioned and unsanctioned bodies. If we turn to the globe on the top figure, there is an extensive trace of an attempt to re-establish the intended aesthetic wholeness of the surface, I would say. As you can imagine, I've spent quite a lot of time with the sculptures, and I noticed over time an unevenness that I'm trying to on the surface of the globe. And this unevenness could not be explained by the graffiti alone. The surface is uneven in terms of the sheen, but also the color is varying greatly from greenish in some spaces to yellow and gilded here at the bottom. And looking at the photo that I showed you previously, it's quite heavy, you can actually really see how great a difference there is to the sheen of the globe if you look at the photo from 1912 and now. And it can not only be explained by deterioration of the surface, I would say. And zooming in on the photo, you can also see that already in 1912 there was quite extensive performance of graffiti or mark making on the globe, with classics such as Cock, but also initials, as you see here. And there's also some paint drips visible on the surface of the globe. And I then took these two photos and tried to relate them to the globe and tried to, by tracing this collection point of the globe, but also of the paint drips as a guideline to try to find these graffitis once again. And they are gone. They have been wiped from, or basically painted over on the surface, only enhancing my suspicion that they had been, in fact, painted over at some point. And I actually convinced our conservator to do a little scratching of the layers to try to find out how many there are, which you can see here. And it shows quite clearly that there is at least a second layer of paint on top of the original building. But also you can see that in other spaces, more recent graffitis have actually cut through the secondary layer that has been applied. And that someone definitely did not enjoy the graffitis on these sculptures. And probably someone sanctioned, since they were able to go through the time of actually painting it over. And I've tried to sort of date it based on this, and I can only make it out that it's based on another graffiti that's the latest has been painted over in 1912. But I also think it's quite interesting that in spite of this re-establishment of an even whole surface of the globe, this practice of mark making definitely continued, and it is quite extensive. In a way, they sort of wiped the board and made space for new graffitis. And repairs like these are actually visible throughout the sculptures, the repairs that have tried to re-establish them as they were supposed to look. Some of them are more successful than others. There are some quite discreet retouches, which you can barely make out here, of scratches made on the sculptures. But also some that are really glaringly obvious, like this repair in one of the woodworkers' clubs, and the repair in the beard and here, which kind of make you wonder, is it a lack of ability and by the people who have performed these repairs, or is it a lack of fund, or is it a deliberate intervention to try to actually show people that this is a repair and communicate that they have been that they are taken care of, but also that they have been broken at some point. And And exploring the relationship between the different episodes of engagement and their physical environment, I think, is quite important to make sense of these services. I just shown you before I was here practice across the City Hall, but if we turn to the wood roses, I kind of also realized it for another way. So today, the sculptures, they stand on the floor independently of the sculptural group they were a part of. And looking at the drawing I showed you earlier from 1941, they seemingly also did so in 1941, if it is to be trusted. However, if you look at how graffiti is spread out on the sculptures, it is concentrated on the legs. And I don't know about you, but I would find it really uncomfortable to stand or squat for extended periods of time to actually scratch graffiti. And it's comparatively, graffiti is so extensive on the legs compared to the torso that it would make sense that they had been installed in another manner, so to speak. And the photo I showed you previously was actually a photo I found quite recently that at least confirmed that at some point they have been exhibited on a plinth that would actually place them at perfect height for art makers to do their thing, so to speak. And relating this photo to, this is where it's quite noted, the differences in varnish on the floor of the city of the tower. It seems possible that the plinths were also moved up to the 9th floor when they were moved from the attic hallway, and actually enabled them to be at this nice height for a graffiti marking. But it also makes me question the traces of graffiti on their faces, like this one, because that would demand something completely different from the users or the visitors who would be making their marks. It would demand that they either had climbed onto the plinths or onto something else to make them, or that they were made after they had been put behind the wall, which is also a possibility. And coming back to this, how we are working with them now. So since 2021, the cultural heritage value of both the sanctioned and unsanctioned services and interventions on these sculptures have been recognized by the museum and City Hall, and will therefore be preserved. As such, you would think now that the services are fixed, and especially as we have to put them behind a glass barrier which is locked, and it does limit the access to them, and in theory that also prevents further unsanctioned interventions. However, this was something I discovered quite recently, so you get the joy of seeing it now. When I was registering Summer to Graffiti back in January, I discovered a new graffiti had been added. And it sort of follows the same conventions as the above-mentioned graffiti's log notes. And you can see, this a type of heart is also right next to the one that's quite new. And some mark maker between December 2023 and January 2024 managed to make a new graffiti behind a locked gate. And I expect that the person did not expect it to be noticed, and I only noticed it because I was looking at comparative photos of them in my registration efforts, which basically reflects how unstable these surfaces are in spite of being seemingly fixed and protected. And it also, this graffiti, it cuts through several older graffitis, basically deteriorating them or destroying them, but also through layers of graffiti, or not layers of graffiti, but also after layers of repair and the original surface and its paint. Basically also in another surface that I haven't really touched upon, which is the surface generated by the touch of visitors which have generally changed the appearance or color of the surfaces and buffing it up. So it really entangles itself so much on this wide narrative of the sculptures by using both the format but also of other older graffitis and relating to it, but also by cutting through so many previous layers. So I'm about to go into the final part of and try to sum up what all of these kind of mean and what they can tell us about how these site and surface negotiations can enlighten us, and spending time on them can enlighten us on how the function and meaning of these sculptures have developed through their various entanglements. And when I look at them, I see a group of objects whose function, meaning, and appearance have been and still are negotiated through various engagements and entanglements, unsanctioned modifications, which are, I would say, are often spontaneous, interact with or intersect with interventions by the sanctioned caretaking bodies, which are often premeditated for some time. And past visitors to the exhibition of the City Hall collections might have recognized that the commemorative origin of the iconography of the sculptures through either their own memory, the dissemination in science, guidebooks, public media, such as the newspaper clippings mentioned previously, and perceive the space to be a part of a public exhibition. However, the impact we could also see of sculptures, this touching of sculptural surfaces, is quite an innocent interaction, which most people don't really know have an impact, but we often unconsciously touch these same spaces or places on the sculptures because of their accessibility and what they represent. So they would perhaps have thought this was an innocent interaction with the sculptures that didn't constitute vandalism, as some would call it. But what these visitors would also have recognized was another commemorative practice performed in the exhibition space in the form of visitor mark making. The I was here graffiti are an expression of their perception of the space and a record of it, I would say. It is adding to a commemorative practice and interaction with history that is taking place in this space. And while some graffiti also reflect attested boundaries, such as this graffiti in the armpit of the sculpture, at the top one saying ha ha ha. Attested boundaries, some also you could also argue that they are an attempt to claim a place in this commemorative and heritage space. And the retouches of paint and expression of a few tentative steps towards removing the traces of graffiti before recognizing that this would significantly impact and change the original polychrome surface in an acceptable manner, or that it would be too costly, is also reflected in these as I see them now. Especially the costliness of it is, and the ineffectiveness of these retouches is reflected really in the sculptures because of the so soon redrawing and recarving of the globe. And this really marks our position as caretakers that we have a significant responsibility in relation to what story the sculptures and monuments in our public spaces reflect and who's represented and whose voices are heard or erased in some cases. And as we, the Museum of Copenhagen and the City Hall agree that these surface modifications should be recognized for their historical and cultural value, we transform them from vandalism to cultural history. The sculptures then begin to perform in a new manner. They are not kept to only represent how physically, if not in terms of dissemination yet, they don't really represent only the Royal Golden's wedding celebration, but they also now show that later acts of engagements are equally recognized with this story. They are now sanctioned, and they appear along with older sanctioned engagements. And in a way, they visually communicate that this is a negotiated space that we are in. And I was just about to finish off, but these marks and interventions reflect really how people's actions, practices, and memories and values have changed, but also how they interact through time. And embracing them, we also embrace that they reflect multiple narratives and everyday interactions. They embrace and accepting means also we embrace the multiculturalism and social diversity that they represent. And one thing that I would finally also mark is that in a way they add names, dates and nationalities to visitors to the tower who would otherwise just be a number on the record, such as these you see here. Which I think adds to actually the value they have now, that we get this perspective on them. And basically by including these sensitivities to surfaces and sites in our analysis, I would argue, and use the sensitivity, I would argue that we can then start to unlock the unstableness of sculptures and monuments, but also that unlock that they can be understood in multiple ways and interacted with in multiple ways that could be independent of the intended commemorative function. And thank you for listening.